Hello, everybody, and welcome back to What Does Jesus Teach? Today, we're going to be entering part 16 of the overall discussion of pre-wrath versus pre-tribulation doctrine. Uh, let's jump in. Now, I thought it would be a nice change in the series because there's still some more pieces to talk about. But I had an interesting discussion with a pre-tribulation believer who claims that he's been studying end times doctrine for quite some time, and he's, super convinced that pre-tribulation is correct for a variety of reasons, a lot of which we've already discussed. So I thought it'd be interesting to share some of the conversation that he and I had. Now, when I first started talking to him, I figured, as I would do with anybody else on any topic, let's first figure out where we have common ground. And for me, as it relates to the end times discussion of the timing of the rapture, there's two passages that I like to make sure up front that we have full agreement on, because they're two passages that specifically talk about the timeline. And if you've watched the other videos, you'll recognize, these two passages, hopefully. So the first one is Daniel 9:27, and the second one is Second Thessalonians 2:3 through 4. And what I'd like to double check to make sure that in Daniel 9:27, it's talking about what's believed to be the Antichrist coming in the middle of the week, causing an abomination of desolation, and that falls in the middle of the 7 year period. And in Second Thessalonians 2:3 through 4, where it refers to the man of lawlessness being revealed, when he takes his place in the temple, proclaimed that he's God, are we talking about the same event? Now, in short, we had full agreement. So as long as we have full agreement in that, we can then proceed to what I was hoping was a graceful conversation. Okay. So what I did was, and I'm showing you exactly what I did, I kind of made a graph that's similar to some of the ones that I have in my other videos. But what I did was I kind of made this process where as we're conversing, I'm letting him explain the pre-tribulation view. And what I'm doing is I'm plugging in the points as we walk through it. So I started with this one. Again, really quick, we have the green, which refers to today. The blue is the first 3.5 years of the 7 year period, and the red is the second half, 3.5 year period. And of course, I marked as mutually agreed that the Antichrist is revealed in the middle, and the beginning of the 7 year period is the beginning of the blue. Okay. So we kind of walked through all the verses, and let's just go ahead and jump in it. So we went through First Thessalonians 2:1, and he agreed that Paul is talking about the rapture there because it's Jesus Christ in our gathering. We went to First Thessalonians 2:7 and talking about when the restrainer is taken out of the way. So I took those two pieces and I placed them exactly as he is describing them. So what I'm letting him do, I'm letting him paint the picture with his words, and I'm simply putting it in graphics and kind of sending it to him as I go along in the conversation. So now we have new graphics. So we have what he sees as the rapture and the Holy Spirit and or the church being the restrainer being taken out. So he sees that at the end, before his excuse me 7 year period begins, the rapture takes place, the restrainer is gone, and there's a minor little gap between the end of that and the beginning of the 7 year period. He couldn't identify how long the gap was, but he says that there is some sort of a gap. I'm like, okay, that's fine. We'll move on. I don't agree with that, but so far I'm just painting his picture. Okay, then we move on to verse 3, when it says, not to be deceived, because it will not come, the day of the Lord, unless the apostasy comes first and the man of lawlessness is revealed. So he believes the apostasy is taking place right now. So I place the apostasy as it's happening today. And of course, when I send the picture, he agreed with it. This is the picture. It's the same as I wanted 2 seconds ago. I'm just adding in the apostasy here, right? He believed it's happening today. Again, I don't necessarily agree with that, but I'm just pointing, you know, I'm adding to the graphic as he's describing it. And up to this point, he's pretty good with it. So far, he agreed with the graphic as I made a visual representation. He even said, "Hey, good job!" Like I think he was excited, thinking that I'm accepting what he's given me. But with this one, I'm just kind of letting him speak and get his position out, and I'm just kind of asking questions along the way. And at a certain point, we went back to Second Thessalonians 2 regarding the day of the Lord. Now, one thing he was very insistent on is that there is a gap of time between the rapture and the day of the Lord commencing. He doesn't believe they're actually back to back events. Again, I didn't offer a correction at this point. I just wanted him to get everything out. So, according to Second Thessalonians 2:2, that's talking about the day of the Lord. And When it talks about the next verse, the day will not come, it's referring to the day of the Lord. So I wanted to walk through this very, very slowly. And I wanted to make sure that the Second Thessalonians 2 reference of the day of the Lord was agreed upon when it looks at verse 3 and it says, it will not come. And then he agreed that those two things in bold, those two phrases are the same thing. He confirmed that. He says, yes, absolutely. That makes sense. Okay. So I read the verse and asked if he agrees that the day of the Lord cannot begin until after the apostasy and the revelation of the Antichrist in the temple. He said, yes. So I graphed it under his agreement. And one additional thing, is that he mentioned repeatedly to convince me that, the wrath of God, I'm sorry, that the day of the Lord, um, in the beginning of the day of the Lord, that's when the seals are being opened, and that's also part of God's wrath. So before I even finish the picture, he's very adamant that no, when the day of the Lord begins, you're going to see the seals being opened, and that's the wrath of God. I was surprised to hear that after him agreeing that the day of the Lord begins after the revelation of the Antichrist. So I went ahead and graphed them together. And this is when the conversation went sour. So everything here, I kind of go. So here we have the today, right? The apostasy, as he described it. He said the rapture was here, and of course, this begins a 7-year period, right? In this blue bucket here, the Antichrist is revealed publicly in the temple, and the day of the Lord is sometime. And I make sure he understood the chart is not set to scale. This is just to show that sometime after this middle point of the revelation of the Antichrist, as he agreed, the day of the Lord from verse 2 happens sometime after this period. Again, I made a reference to what he agreed with already, which is it will not come unless the apostasy comes first and the man in laws is revealed in the temple and so on. And I also added a little extra spot here because he was adamant that when the day of the Lord begins, that's when the seals start opening. So in his model, we have the seals opening after the middle of the 7-year period because he was adamant that that's when the day of the Lord begins, you'll see it starting with the opening of the seals. And since he agreed that the day of the Lord began after the middle, I placed it here. And then I also then pointed out, hey, but that also means that between the rapture over here and this point over here, there's a 3.5+ year gap. Of course, now all of a sudden it's like, well, wait a minute. No, 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 that's not the case. You have the graphic wrong. And I kind of asked him to point out where my graphic was wrong because up to that point, everything was good. We agreed on the other pieces, but now suddenly something is wrong. And of course, he believes something is wrong because it makes it very obvious that the way he explained it has a really large gap. It's almost like saying that when the 7-year period begins, we have there's no tribulation, there's just nothing going on because the tribulation begins with the opening of the seals, which he agreed to, but the seals begin the day of the Lord. See, it's you can't explain that away. You're kind of stuck. So it was interesting because obviously he quickly objected, and I explained that I was a little puzzled because we both agreed that Paul explicitly said that the day of the Lord doesn't begin until after the revelation of the Antichrist. And after some back and forth, I think as he was stuck, he had to figure out some way to explain it. He then gives me clarification that what Paul meant, even though that's not what's said, is that another part of God's wrath comes at that time. So it's kind of more like a phase 2 of the day of the Lord happening after the revelation of the Antichrist. So pointing back here, he's saying that this part here, the red, like it will not come unless, and this part over here, he says this is like a second part, like the second wave of the day of the Lord, not the first wave. Even though Paul makes no, again, this is literal right here. Paul makes no mention of this, being like a second wave or a stronger wave of the day of the Lord. But that's what now he's forced to come to a conclusion of because he basically pinched himself into a hole. Because now that he saw graphically what he was claiming and he obviously sees that's wrong, he obviously had to come up with something. So basically, we see here the first piece of evidence of looking at Paul's direct reference to a timeline and the pre-tribulation believer is saying something very different is meant in the words of Paul. That to me is adding or deleting from the scriptures to come up with such a conclusion. But again, when he explains this afterwards, after he got put in a hole, he says, oh, it's because of the context of all the other passages about end times. And I'm like, okay, I'm trying to keep it peaceful. I'm like, I expressed disagreement, however, uh, but then what I ended up coming back to at the end was, before we moved on, was, if that's the case, then this passage alone does not support pre-tribulation, because you would have to know about some other reference talking that there's a multi-phase, there's two beginnings of the day of the Lord. And again, he didn't like that expression, but that's basically what he's claiming. So he moved on. Okay. So now we move on to the next one, which is his next line of defense was regarding the 24 elders in Revelations 4 through 5, mostly referred to be representing the church. And I think most pre tribulation believers agreed that the 24 elders are the church. So because of when they pop up in Revelations 4, it's assumed that, hey, this is where the rapture took place, because you see the church there. The elders of the church. Okay. So the four main points that he brought up to try to explain that this is the church is, they're dressed in white because believers are promised white garments. They're wearing crowns, and specifically called Stephanos in the Greek. Uh, they also sing a song about becoming a kingdom of priests. And the elders not found in the Old Testament anywhere. And because the church is not found in the Old Testament, this must be the church. So he kind of expresses this as, these are four individual things about any one of these would prove it's a church without any doubt. And surely all four together would prove it's a church. So, but only one is required. So let me walk through all four of these. Okay, the first claim, they're dressed in white. Okay, the problem with that is that we have other heavenly beings, even in the New Testament alone, that are dressed in white. Mostly angels. We have John 20, verse 12, Acts 1, verse 10, Matthew 28, verse 3, and Mark 16, verse 5, all show heavenly beings or angelic beings. Uh, you know, they're wearing white. So wearing white in heaven is not exclusive to the church. If everything that comes down from heaven, from the Lord, comes out in white, then it's not exclusive to the church. So it would be biblically inconsistent to say that because they're dressed in white, that somehow proves that the church, when there's other beings that are also dressed in white in heaven. The second one, I love this one. They're wearing crowns, and specifically in the Greek, Stephanos crowns. Um, to be super clear, and please look this up yourself, Stephanos is simply the Greek word for crown, and was used sometimes as a reference to like a victory crown, kind of like in the Olympics back in the day, or what you imagine old people in Greece wearing those green wreaths around their head. Those are also called Stephanos. It's just a crown. It's just something that goes around you, a wreath or a of a metallic nature, like a golden crown, for example. It could also be a wreath that's used to signify like a victory. So here's the problem: we have other characters in the book of Revelations alone wearing Stephanos. And by the way, I want to clarify, Stephanos is not a kind of crown, it's just crown. Uh, how you use that crown can vary. You can use it for victory, you can use it for authority, right? But a crown is a crown, Stephanos just means crown. But for some reason, it's almost looked at like an adjective of crown when really it just means the noun crown. Now, however, that word being used, or Stephanos or crown, is not exclusive to the church. Like, for example, in Revelation 6:2, it talks about the horse rider wearing a crown. And that's agreed upon by pre tribulation believers, that horse rider is the Antichrist. So he was wearing a crown. Does that mean he was a church? Of course not. The woman in Revelation 12:1, which again is generally agreed upon that refers to Israel, is also wearing a crown. But nobody will say that's a church either. And even Revelations 14:14, the demon locusts are wearing golden crowns, golden Stephanos. And surely nobody's going to say that the demon locusts that are killing people are part of the church. So we have all these characters wearing Stephanos, wearing crowns, golden crowns at that. So it is not biblically consistent to say wearing a crown or a Stephanos means that the elders become the church, because they're basically wearing something that other characters are wearing. It is not exclusive to the church. Number three, they, another reason is because they sing a song about becoming a kingdom of priests. Indeed, there is a song in Revelations 5 that the 24 elders are singing about the church becoming a kingdom of priests. this song is sung together with the four living creatures that are with them. Under pre-tribulation, it's taught that the singing uh, of the song must mean that the elders represent the church. Okay, there's two problems with that. One, the song they are singing is about others as they sing it in the third person. Now that alone doesn't disprove it. But if the song isn't about themselves, why assume it's about them in the first place? There is a reference in the Old Testament singing the song of Moses in the third person, but it also includes a first person mix in there. So I've heard that a couple times before. But in general, it is sung in a third person. Now, if you're a KJV or New King James Version or modern, etc., you'll see it in the first person. However, as explained in one of my other videos as well, I use the earliest manuscript options possible. If you're, adamant about the King James Version, there's another piece we can talk about. You can put a comment. I can point you to where that's at. But in the modern versions, or should I say in the earlier manuscript versions, which happen to be the modern translations, it's all comes out in the third person. uh, but even if that wasn't the case, here's the other problem. The main issue is that, hey, the 24 elders are singing this song, so that, and only the ones singing it can be the church. Well, here's the issue. Those four living creatures that are with the 24 elders are also singing that song, but for some reason they're not part of the church. Again, so if the reason or the evidence of being the church is that they're singing the song, well then why aren't the four living creatures also the church? See, again, it's biblically inconsistent. You're applying a rule that you make exclusive to the church, but then that rule then doesn't apply to other things because you're forced to kick the four living creatures out because of the doctrine. See, it doesn't make sense. You can't say that the elders of the church, because they sing this song, and only they can sing the song. But then there's other people singing the song, and then they can't be the church. Yeah, it's not biblically consistent. The fourth one, yes, elders not found in the Old Testament. The claim is that there is no prior reference to the 24 elders being in heaven before this time. Therefore, this must be the church. Okay, so there's two references I'm going to point to outside of the book of Revelation. In Ephesians 3:10, we see Paul pointing to rulers that already exist in heaven. And that's not talking about the church. It's, if you read it, you'll see that. The elders can certainly be considered rulers in heaven based on their description. Now, I'm not going to say that that alone is conclusive that the rulers in heaven are specifically the 24 elders, but it can point in that direction. I'm not going to be dogmatic about it because it doesn't say it specifically. However, when we get to Isaiah 24:23 in the Old Testament, it references the Lord's elders, which that right there proves elders did exist in the Old Testament. Though the number 24 may not be referenced, that doesn't disprove that there are heavenly elders already that belong to the Lord. So this now destroys that last piece. Elders were never talked about in the Old Testament or outside the book of Revelation. Well, there's one in the New Testament that refers to its possibility, but the more definite one is in Isaiah 24:23 that talks about elders of the Lord. So yeah, it kind of destroys all four arguments, doesn't it? Uh, my friend didn't like any of this conversation. He didn't appreciate finding, especially Isaiah 24:23. I don't think he's ever seen that. And his words are not kind. Most of it had to do with just saying that I was not willing to be taught. I was not considering the context and other, nothing profane, but other colorful language describing how I just didn't care to listen. But it really was one sided because if I agree with what he said, suddenly I'm amazing. But if I don't agree, I'm a horrible listener. Um, anyway, moving on. Okay. The other topic that we spoke on is that the pre tribulation believer points to the opening of the seals as the beginning of God's wrath. Now, in addition, which is a focal point of the conversation, is that whether even under pre tribulation, or here's my question, under pre trib, under that doctrine, can a saint experience God's wrath? Now, we both agreed, as generally most people do, that God's wrath never, ever, 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 ever will fall upon the righteous, but only the wicked. Now, tribulation, persecution, martyrdom do fall upon the righteous. But that's not from God. That's the devil, the Antichrist, or humans under the influence of those two. Usually referred to as a mystery of lawlessness by Paul in the New Testament. Now, the pre-tribulation believer I spoke to states that a person who comes to faith after the pre-tribulation rapture does experience God's wrath because that person waited too long and happens to have come to faith during the 7 year period. And I'm like, okay, wait a minute. Let me just read my response and I'll add to it because sometimes I get ahead of myself. So here's what I responded to him with. I said, look, you defined the wrath of God as commencing with the opening of the seals. However, your definition of God's wrath is inconsistent. Persecution, affliction, and martyrdom has happened to the saints of God before, during, and after the period of the law of Moses. Never is this kind of thing attributed as God's wrath. Inconsistently, you apply the exact same thing as being God's wrath only for the reason of the timing of such an occurrence. It is therefore biblically inconsistent to suggest the same thing as God's wrath in one 7 year period, but not God's wrath regarding every other time period of human existence. In other words, it's like, you know, the persecution of the saints has never been God's wrath from the beginning of time, ever. I mean, like never. Uh, but then in this one 7 year period of history, the persecution, affliction, martyrdom, the killing of the saints suddenly is part of God's wrath because they just happen to have come to faith at the wrong time. There's no wrong time to come to faith. It's good news when you come to faith. You get to be with the Lord. Now, whether you come to faith under more difficult circumstances or less than difficult circumstances, hey, that's on us. We can come to faith now, come to faith later. But the timing of coming to faith and becoming righteous, becoming a saint, does not change whether the same activity is considered God's wrath or not. See, what he's doing is he's changing the definition of the word based on the timing of when it happens. And again, biblically inconsistent. You can clearly see how, again, oh yeah, I did get ahead of myself, how inconsistently a definition is applied here. It is only done to protect a doctrine. I tried to point out that the seals are not God's wrath because they are not actually initiated by God. God doesn't command those events to happen, nor does the representative from God cause the events to happen during the opening of the seals. But the person insists that this is God's wrath because of the pre-tribulation rapture. It's basically saying, because I believe this is true, then this event has to mean something different because of what I believe. Rather than saying, let me look at the events and let the events define the reality, as opposed to making my personal reality affect the way the scripture is read. So in this case, this only shows that the only way to say that that this is God's wrath is because you must first accept pre-tribulation rapture as true to then come to that conclusion. Now, here's my response I gave after he insisted on this. I said, you also state that the opening of the seals is part of God's wrath. Yet we do not find God himself conducting affliction, persecution, or martyrdom, nor do we find any of his representatives conducting such things. The burden of proof falls on you to show if this is God permitting the events or God causing the events, which would be the definition of God's wrath. We also read that the opening of the seals is not causing the wrath to pour. If an opening of the seal brings up new kinds of wrath each time, then we have a problem with the fifth and sixth seal, which present no new wrath coming upon the earth. The fifth seal shows the dead martyrs, they're already dead, crying out, asking when God's judgment will begin. Side note, if they're asking when the judgment is going to begin, and everybody agrees that God's judgment is God's wrath, why are they asking for when something is going to begin if it's supposedly, according to pre-tribulation, already begun? I digress. I'll continue. But no wrath is introduced. Their death is from the events that unfolded during the prior seal's opening. The sixth seal presents the celestial signs, which causes everyone to realize that the day of the Lord has arrived, now asking to be killed because of what is about to come. The celestial signs taking place while the sixth seals is being opened are not wrath. They are simply signs. If the whole thing was God's wrath, the statement of the day of the wrath having arrived or come, during the opening of the sixth seal that would then be mentioned at the opening of the first seal, and it would be realized at that point, not after all this time has taken place of persecution and martyrdom for like over 3.5 years. So that's what I wrote. Now, I will say, and if I put it on the next slide, then I apologize. I just don't want to miss this point. You know, it's very strange that, like, say, if I came to faith after the tribulation already began and I became a saint, I became a child of God, that I get to experience God's personal punishment to me that's designated for the wicked. That's basically what that's saying. If I come to faith, day two of after the pre-tribulation rapture, I'm going to experience the full blown of God's wrath unless I die first. And but I'm able to experience the trumpets, it just everything. If I survive as long as the 7 years, I'm gonna experience every little bit of God's wrath being a child of God, which is biblically inconsistent with the rest of the Bible. Again, obviously there's more details in the pieces I'm sharing, but the idea is just to show generally or a high level how inconsistent a person needs to be when you present the questions against the pre-tribulation doctrine. See, the person claims that he studied end time theology for years, which is why I wanted to see how my questions held up against the doctrine. I really just wanted to see how it went. As hey, he claims that he has all these years of knowledge, but I think he got caught metaphorically with his pants down, and he had to come up with some additional explanations, or just use the tried and true or false, however you want to look at it, way of saying, "Hey, you're just not getting the right context," or "You're just not getting it." Now, I understand that the Word of God is spiritually discerned. I agree with that 100%. If the Holy Spirit is not in you, there are going to be some things in the Bible that you just will not understand no matter what. However, spiritual discernment does not nullify the actual words. Most importantly, going back to Second Thessalonians 2, it says, the Lord will not come until after the revelation of the Antichrist in the temple. Period. It will not come. It does not say the day of the Lord that is already here will be expanded during this time period. So you see how you have to be inconsistent or come up with some crazy way to defend something as opposed to just letting the words speak for themselves. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the dialogue that I shared with you. Again, it's not the entire thing, and we'd be here for several hours, and nobody sits through a 3 or 4 hour video. No, not usually anyway. If I have more discussion or discussions with somebody else, I'll be happy to share it. With that being said, God bless you, and may God's grace be upon you.